to be very Dickens-centered. So our first speaker is Marijke Boucherie from the University of Lisbon.
Thank you. Thank you, Amandio, for asking me to join in this wonderful gathering. I'm going to say something small about Dickens, and I would like, I have written about Dickens, but to me Dickens is first of all a poet. So now I have adjusted a little bit my point of view and looked at David Copperfield more from a point of view of family a little bit. Nevertheless, I would like to begin my talk with a quote from Nabokov, who says about Dickens, "The enchanter interests me more than the yarn spinner or the teacher. It is his imagery that is great." And that's, I agree with Nabokov. Okay. So the personal history of David Copperfield was published in book form in 1850. It had been serialized 2 years before. It was Charles Dickens' 8th novel and the first with a first-person narrator. It is the life story of a lost orphan child that, thanks to willpower and forceful endeavor, becomes a famous writer, happily married to a saintly wife and father of many children. So it's a fairy story. The story follows, as it were, a line of repression, throwing overboard all that has to be repressed in function of the successful ending. In this sense, the novel David Copperfield delights the reader with a wealth of irresistible second characters that, to me at least, constitute the attraction of the novel. These secondary characters have many functions as allies or opponents of the hero's plight. Many have no well-defined role in the plot, but populate the novel, often as foil to David's progress. Therefore, they are mostly intended as comic or entertaining. I think very much of the old Brazilian telenovelas, soap operas, in which the secondary characters are, let's say, the Jews of the matter. Yet their singularity makes them unique. David Copperfield certainly confirms the critic Douglas Fairhurst when he says that Dickens' novels celebrate, and I quote, "the unique, the freakish, the stubbornly eccentric, while always reminding us what we have in common," end quote. The universal appeal of David Copperfield is related to the fact that David is a 19th century hero, heir to romantic ideals of totality and self-fulfillment. Therefore, his concept of language is haunted by the desire for analogy. In a sense, the novel, and one could say the whole of Dickens' work, asks the question of how to speak of difference when one is steeped in longings for the origin and the desire for universal belonging. One possible answer lies in the convention of the Bildungsroman. As a first-person narrative, David Copperfield tells his life story from the point of view of his adult self as a successful writer. As the critic Tambling says, the Wordsworthian vision of the child as father of the man is firmly reversed, and the man fathers the child in retrospective narration. The assurance conveyed through the structure allows for the freakish to emerge without being threatening. Furthermore, the close relationship that the tale establishes with the reader grounds David's narrative in a sheltered bond that begins with the very first sentence, and I quote, "Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show." So we need not read plot through 850 pages to know that he will be the hero of his own life. From the very beginning, the narrator puts into the hands of the reader the responsibility for the outcome of his endeavor. The stratagem of empowering the reader by directly involving him or her is one of the main stratagems stratagems of Dickens' art. The critic Mark Lambert speaks of, and I quote, the erotic triangle of character, reader, author, as one of the things that make Charles Dickens world literature, end quote. And he continues to say, as opposed to, for instance, George Eliot, who is a much more intelligent writer, yet remains English literature, says Lambert. I would suggest that this is the first of the many bizarre family plots of David Copperfield, namely the relationship between David, the reader, and Dickens. Books can be a haven, a family of sorts. One can find safety from abuse in books. And one can, of course, also be abused by books. Like David himself, who, as an abused child, reads the novels his father has left him and says this beautiful sentence, I quote, reading as if for life, end quote. I have written about David Copperfield before and have analyzed the novel as a kind of rhapsody of the letter D. D refers to Dickens, to David, and to the renaming that David's receptive nature invites as if he were everyone's special darling. His friend Steerforth calls David Daisy, a girl's name that emphasizes the strong erotic bond between the two young men. It is perhaps allowed to mention here that it was said of Dickens himself that he had something feminine about him. That was his friend John Foster who said this. So, David is Daisy to Steerforth. His first wife, Dora, whose name also begins with a D, calls him Dodie. For others, he is Davy or Master David. The letter D is also the letter where Dr. Strong, a secondary character, where Dr. Strong's dictionary is left off at the end of the novel. And finally, D is the first letter of the name of Mr. Dick, the mad gentleman who becomes David's guardian. Later, David will be renamed as Trotwood by his aunt, and it is as Trotwood that his unhappy childhood ends and the ascent to success begins, a long ascent, but it's a sure one. One could thus consider the names David Trotwood as a contrastive pair. David's identity, a movement of negotiation between the voiced plosive D of desire and the voiceless plosive T of the tyranny of conforming. The binary opposition between desire and discipline, between male and female, between pleasure and duty, are some of the oppositions that David must squeeze into a single identity. But the young hero soon finds out that the world is a place full of confusion, where everything is and is not at the same time. Reality does not appear in neat binary oppositions, but in manifold forms that he has difficulty in reading and interpreting. Families are especially hard to understand. When, as a child, David is the guest of Mr. Peggotty and spends some time in his houseboat with what he supposes to be Mr. Peggotty's wife and children, he finds out that everyone is hardly related to the other. As a family living together, their bond is one of mutual support and care. The scene where David gradually learns about the secrets that bind the members of his family together, secrets mostly related to death, is one of the many occasions in the novel where the reader assists at David's growing awareness of the facts of life while meandering through a variety of human landscapes. Throughout the novel, David meets many oddly composed families, existing on the fringes of society. For those who are familiar with the novel, I evoke here, of course, Mr. Micawber and his unflinching, devoted wife and increasing offspring. There is Peggotty and Barkis, who propose to Peggotty Barkis proposed to Peggotty after having tasted her pies, which is a very good reason for marriage, with the words, Barkis is willing. There is the vicious couple of Uriah Heep and his mother, and in many novels, Dickens very often portrays a young male hero with the mother in a small lyrical moment. For instance, Mr. Mell, who plays the flute to his mother. The pleasant and asthmatic undertaker, Mr. Omer, and his daughter, and the very lovable Traddles, who, after years of waiting to marry his bride, takes all her sisters in as well. There are also Mr. Murdstone and his sister, professional malefactors who exploit David's mother and abuse her child. However, the family that has become most memorable, to me at least, not only because of the plot, but also because of its symbolic meaning for David as a writer, are the man and the woman who adopt David when, as a young fugitive, he arrives at their doorstep. Aunt Betsy and the mad gentleman she shelters, Mr. Dick. Aunt Betsy, in full Betsy Trotwood, is introduced in the very first chapter of David's narrative as a formidable personage. The description of her attire points to traits of a masculine world. Her dress, I quote, her dress was scanty made, as if she desired to be as little encumbered as possible. She wore at her side a gentleman's gold watch. She had some linen at her throat, not unlike a shirt collar, etc. The angular, strong-willed woman has rejected David as his birth for not being a girl. Yet, when years later David knocks at her door as a lost child, she takes him in. It is very interesting to notice that David will start his education under the tutelage of someone who rejected him for not being someone else. In other words, he will grow into his socially accepted role by willfully battling what he calls his wayward heart. Not to be dominated by passion, to become strong and invulnerable. This is the hoped-for ideal. When David falls madly in love with Dora, a child wife and also a D, and a child wife and singularly inadequate as a housewife, he must kill her off, in the narrative I mean, with their stillborn child. It seems that no well-balanced life can grow out of a marriage ruled by desire. At a certain moment in the novel, Betsy Trotwood asks the rhetorical question of how it is possible that David's dead father, could marry such an impossible girl as his mother. And Mr. Dick answers, because perhaps she loved him. Perhaps she took pleasure in him, which are absurd answers in the novel. David himself calls Dora, and I quote, the first mistaken impulse of an undisciplined heart. To a post-Freudian reader, and one knows that David Copperfield was a novel that Freud cherished, to a post-Freudian reader, the condescension described towards the child wife, meant to be comic, does not hide a male's profound disdain for a woman character under the disguise of affable tolerance and desire to protect. Aunt Betsy's original hope for a niece is, so she wanted a girl. She didn't want David to be a boy, she wanted David to be a girl. So Aunt Betsy's original hope for a niece is motivated by her wish to be able to educate a girl in order to prevent her being abused by men, as she herself has been. In her strong mindset, a newborn baby boy can only belong to the future race of males who harm women. In David, however, she could not have found a more receptive pupil for her moral admonitions. And I quote, never be mean, never be false, never be cruel. The truth is that Aunt Betsy protects David throughout his life with kindness and care. Her experience of having been badly treated herself, leads Aunt Betsy to protect the vulnerable victims of injustice, like David, but also like Mr. Dick, the gentleman she protects and who shares the house with her. From the very beginning and through their relationship with Aunt Betsy, David and Mr. Dick appear as possible doubles. The analogy between the two characters is further emphasized by the fact that Mr. Dick, like the narrator David, is writing his memorial or life story. Mr. Dick's full name is Richard Babley, a name resonant with inchoate babbling. And indeed, his family considers him to be mad and wants him to confine to an asylum. Mr. Dick's main occupation is to write his memorial, his life story, as appeal to the court for justice. However, each time that Mr. Dick starts writing, we would say in the 20th century, in the 21st century, hallucinates. But in the novel, the severed head of King Charles I keeps floating into the manuscript, and he can neither feel nor write down the upheaval of his mind. It is almost impossible not to make here an allusion to psychoanalytical babbling, according to which only castration makes language possible. Interestingly and beautifully, he uses the aborted manuscript to build gigantic kites, which he flies into the air in order, and I quote Mr. Dick's words, in order to disseminate the statements passed on it. To Miss Betsy, Mr. Dick is a man full of wisdom, whom she nevertheless prohibits to mention King Charles because, and I quote, it's not a businesslike way of speaking, not a worldly way. So she also suppresses psychotic language. Mr. Dick engages with language as a physical entity, as an object made of sound and trace, which he can literally make fly into the air. This is the reason why he loves to listen to Dr. Strong's dictionary, which takes him out of himself, and I quote, upon the wings of hard words. I have written a very long article and complicated article on David Copperfield that I myself don't understand anymore, where I just to hide a small paragraph to show that Jacques Derrida, in his book, La Dissémination de Jacques Derrida, and Mr. Dick in David Copperfield is analogous on at least 10 points. And I'm sure he read it. I'm sure he did. Betsy Trotwood values Mr. Dick's babbling by giving it a place into the context of her bond with him and with David. Mr. Dick's babbling is meaningful because meaning is given to it by a loving and respectful interlocutor. So much so that Mr. Dick ends up having a positive role in the plot. At the end of the novel, Mr. Dick is employed as a copy clerk by Traddles, this most lovely of characters, who gives him 2 tables, one to copy out documents and one to continue his memorial. And thus, from meeting ghosts in writing autobiography to the mechanical craft of copying pre-designed words, Mr. Dick moves from one desk to the other, the narrator says, like a man playing the kettle drum. David Copperfield is the ward of these 2 tutelary figures. One, Aunt Betsy, loving but inflexible. The other, Mr. Dick, childish, submissive, and a little mad. He is even called by his father a natural. This has to do with the context, but I can't go into this now. Like Mr. Dick, David moves between pre-established versions of himself, written by others, and the violence of his desire. But unlike Mr. Dick, he must write at a single desk, transforming the ambiguities in himself into an accepted story of success. There is no narrative structure capable of neatly solving all the contradictions of his plight. David Copperfield, a novel that made Henry James cry, is therefore a perfect example of the baggy monster lamented by the great modernist. Fortunately, or pre-modernist, fortunately for David, and for Dickens for that matter, it is the telling rather than the story that matters. The storytelling calls the reader to life and welcomes him and comforts him, and comforts her. I'm very politically correct. In the house of fiction of David Copperfield, the reader becomes part of a huge family of lovable, odd characters. He is comforted by them, moved, and thus very much alive as part of a big family. Thank you.
Thank you. And now our next speaker is Carra Glatt from Bar-Ilan University.
Midway through Charles Dickens's Bleak House, the shrewish Mrs. Snagsby ponders the series of mysteries enveloping her family. Why has her husband become so distracted and uneasy? Who was the strange client whose death, by spontaneous human combustion, no less, seems to have brought about this change? What business does Mr. Snagsby, a small-time law stationer, have with a police detective and an eminent lawyer who have several times sought him out? What is his connection to the street urchin who has taken to lurking, persistently and unaccountably, by their door? Finally, however, Mrs. Snagsby, as the title of the chapter proclaims, sees it all. And I'm quoting here, Mrs. Snagsby screws a watchful glance on Joe as he is brought into the little drawing room by Guster. He looks at Mr. Snagsby for a moment as he comes in. Aha! Why does he look at Mr. Snagsby? Mr. Snagsby looks at him. Why should he do that? But that Mrs. Snagsby sees it all. Why else should that look pass between them? Why else should Mr. Snagsby be confused and cough a signal cough behind his hand? It is as clear as crystal that Mr. Snagsby is that boy's father. End quote. Mr. Snagsby, of course, is not that boy's father. Mrs. Snagsby is wrong, as she has to be. She is a minor, largely comic character, and whatever mysteries Bleak House contains will not be hers to solve. Yet while Mrs. Snagsby's suspicions are played for comedy, in the narrative world of the Victorian novel, her instincts are not absurd. Bleak House, after all, does prominently feature a hidden parent-child relationship, and in fact, the mystery of Esther Summerson's parentage is central to the intrigue surrounding the Snagsbys. Indeed, more than half of Dickens's novels contain at least one instance of two characters, major or minor, turning out to share a previously unknown family relationship. In some of these cases, including Bleak House, these relationships are ultimately revealed in moving recognition scenes. Today, however, I want to talk about what I think is the odder and less studied phenomenon of family relationships or other family secrets that wind up not being revealed to the party or parties most directly involved. I'm going to focus in particular on two novels, Great Expectations, in which Estella does not learn that she is the daughter of Magwitch and Molly, and Little Dorrit, in which our ostensible hero, Arthur Clennam, remains in the dark about the secret of his own parentage. But I also want to frame the discussion by observing that some version of this plotline actually plays out, or perhaps I should say doesn't play out, with surprising frequency in Dickens. 3 sentences in the concluding chapter of The Old Curiosity Shop reveal, and then dismiss as irrelevant, the likelihood that the dwarf Quilp and the mannish Miss Brass were the parents of the serving girl called the Marchioness, something the now adult Marchioness herself never considers. Her husband, who has put the clues together, decides that since Sophronia, as the Marchioness is now named, quote, was ever a most cheerful, affectionate, and provident wife to him, end quote, he need not trouble himself, or, evidently, her, with his theory. In the Christmas story, Mrs. Lirriper's Legacy, Mrs. Lirriper brings her adopted son to his father's deathbed without ever telling, and to all appearances never planning to tell him, the identity of the dying man, or the sordid story of his own birth to an unmarried woman who died of grief after being abandoned by her lover. Smike dies before learning that he is Nicholas and Kate Nickleby's cousin, and beautiful, rich Edith Dombey never has cause to suspect that she bears the same relationship to a transported thief whose ruin oddly parallels her own. These denied revelations, I would like to suggest, ultimately reveal a certain ambivalence in Dickens towards his own conventions. Dickens, according to his friend and first biographer John Forster, saw coincidence and other improbabilities as properties not only of the novel, but of the world outside of it. Quote, "The world," he would say, "was so much smaller than we thought it. We were all so connected by fate without knowing it. People supposed to be far apart were so constantly elbowing each other, and tomorrow bore so close a resemblance to nothing so much as yesterday." Dickens saw the world, in other words, as a reality not all that dissimilar to the world of an average Victorian novel. For him, there was no necessary conflict between the real and the romantic. At the same time, I think the scene at which Mrs. Snagsby gets poked fun at for, essentially, reading like a Victorian, orphan boy shows up, man of plausibly paternal age, seems shaken, must be father and son, reveals a legitimate discomfort with the trappings of Victorian melodrama. Mrs. Snagsby, no less than David Copperfield's half-mad would-be writer Mr. Dick, is perhaps an image of some disordered aspect of the Dickensian imagination, or, more broadly, of Victorian plotting itself. By foregoing, in several of his novels, the stock recognition scene that would neatly conclude these paternity or identity plots, Dickens naturalizes some of his most potentially melodramatic narrative turns by leaving his characters in a state of imperfect knowledge that more nearly resembles the conditions of actual, unplotted life. The most significant of these denied recognition scenes occurs in Little Dorrit. It is so significant, I think, for three reasons. First, because the character left in the dark is one of the two main characters. There's no other case that I can recall in which one of the protagonists, rather than a supporting character, never learns the secret of his or her own identity. And please, if you think of another example of Dickens or another Victorian novel, let me know after. Second, because the novel features a prominently placed scene in which Amy Dorrit specifically decides not to tell Arthur Clenham, who she's about to marry, what she has discovered. And third, because the scene is framed as a formal rejection of precisely the romantic impulses that have generated it. Even by Victorian standards, and even by Dickens's standards, the plot of Little Dorrit requires a particularly lugubrious bit of narrative contrivance. Mrs. Clenham, it turns out, is not her son Arthur's biological mother, having wrested custody of him from a singer with whom her husband had an affair. More than that, in a fit of guilt over the subsequent death of the singer, her husband's rich uncle arranged for a sizable bequest to be left to the youngest daughter of a music teacher who had supported the young woman, or, if he had no daughters, to his youngest niece, who conveniently turns out to be Amy or Little Dorrit herself. It is a bit bizarre, especially the bequest to one's nephew's lover's music master's niece, and on some level, not obviously necessary. To the extent that Mrs. Clenham, her morbid guilt, and her susceptibility to blackmail from the villainous Rigaud is an integral part of the novel, it seems that it would have been a lot easier for her secret to have been that Arthur was her illegitimate child. At the very least, Dickens might have simplified the plotline by cutting out the two uncles and creating a scenario in which the bequest was a direct legacy from her husband to Little Dorrit's father. Indeed, by the convention of Victorian plotting, it would have been less peculiar if, for instance, the dead singer had turned out to have been a fallen aunt of Little Dorrit's, making Arthur and Amy cousins, in Victorian terms a very good thing for a pair of newlyweds to be, and rendering the bequest less contrived. Instead, Dickens seems to be working hard to make the plot as contrived as possible. Significantly, while the intrigue surrounding Mrs. Clenham is not in itself among the novel's most prominent or memorable plotlines, her secret reveals her to have been the key driver of the novel's events. When someone who has read Little Dorrit recalls the novel, we're likely to think mainly of the story of Amy and her long-imprisoned father, of the Marshalsea and the Circumlocution Office, perhaps of the pre-Ponzi schemer Mr. Myrtle. I'd wager that the dealings of the firm of Clenham & Co. would fall fairly down on our mental lists of the novel's defining scenes and characters. As you indicated, sometimes the secondary characters are far more memorable in Dickens than our ostensible leads. Yet nearly at the end of the novel, the almost parodically Byzantine backstory of the Clenhams is revealed as the hidden machinery that has driven most of the narrative. Arthur and Amy, now at the point of marriage, met because his mother, in an attempt at partial recompense for concealing the shameful bequest, had hired her as a seamstress, and of course Mr. Dorrit would not have been in prison at all had Amy received the money that has long been due to her. He's in prison for debt, so had his daughter gotten a large sum of money, he wouldn't have been. The conspicuous contrivance of Mrs. Clenham's secret thus takes on a disproportionate significance, implicating not only one rather improbable sequence of events, but the very foundations of plot. Like Mr. Myrtle's wealth, the intricate structure of the novel's plot is a house of cards. Our very ability to sustain belief in the world of the novel is threatened by a plot so unnecessarily complicated as to call attention to its own plottedness. Almost as soon as it has been revealed, however, this plot is formally nullified. Immediately before Amy and Arthur go to the church to be married, she makes an unusual request. "I've taken such an odd fancy. I want you to burn something for me." "What?" "Only this folded paper. If you will put it in the fire with your own hand, just as it is, my fancy will be gratified." "Superstitious, darling little Dorrit? Is it a charm?" "It is anything you like best, my own," she answered. "Is it bright enough now?" said Arthur. "Quite bright enough now," said little Dorrit. "Does the charm want any words to be said?" asked Arthur as he held the paper over the flame. "You can say, if you don't mind, 'I love you,'" answered little Dorrit. So he said it, and the paper burned away. End of the quote. The reader understands what Arthur does not. The paper is the proof that would allow Amy to claim her inheritance, Mrs. Clennam having confessed the deception to her, and only to her, just before dying. Little Dorrit can do nothing, of course, to change the effect the other woman has had on the course of her life and her story. Yet in burning the document, little Dorrit, so far as she is able, vacates the force of her discovery, forfeiting the legacy and ensuring that Arthur will never know the truth. There are some obvious story-based reasons for Amy to keep what she's learned from Arthur. She saves him from the knowledge of his illegitimacy, of his birth mother's suffering and his adoptive mother's treachery, and avoids burdening their marriage with guilt over the fortune long denied her, or a sense of inequality created by the fortune now obtained. Yet little Dorrit's act also operates, I want to suggest, on a metatextual level as a revolt against plotting itself. The expectation that vague hints will resolve themselves into satisfying narratives, that long hidden wills wait to reward us, and family secrets lurk in every sharp word and furtive look, is the property of fiction. Our own lives are rarely so melodramatic or so neat. As Dickens and Amy frame it, burning the paper becomes a symbolic passage from a world of romance to a world of realism, and indeed to the world of the real, which is not novelistic at all. Immediately after burning Mrs. Clennam's papers, little Dorrit signs her marriage license, the transition between the two documents suggesting the replacement of the Byzantine contrivance of high melodrama with the naturalized conventions of the marriage plot. Arthur asks for magic words, and Amy replies, "I love you." Beyond that, however, is the struggle of realist narrative to surpass even its own artifice. In burning the papers that implot her narrative, little Dorrit turns the apparatus of fiction against herself. She gathers the powers of fancy, does her charm, and, Prospero-like, burns her book. In our last image of her and Arthur, they are walking away from their own story. This is a passage from the very end of the novel. They all gave place when the signing was done, and little Dorrit and her husband walked out of the church alone. They paused for a moment on the steps of the portico, looking at the fresh perspective of the street in the autumn morning sun's bright rays, and then went down. Went down into a modest life of usefulness and happiness, went quietly down into the roaring streets, inseparable and blessed, and as they passed along in sunshine and shade, the noisy and the eager, the arrogant and the froward and the vain, fretted and chafed and made their usual uproar. There are doubtless stories to be told among that crowd, stories to be designed and plotted and wrapped up, but Amy's and Arthur's will no longer be among them. For the time that remains, I'm going to turn to another and more famous instance of conspicuous narrative contrivance in Dickens, the two endings of Great Expectations. In the case of Great Expectation, our ability to see the joints of the narrative, so to speak, is an accident of literary history. Dickens had already sent his original conclusion, in which Pip and Estella merely greet each other in the street and then part, to John Forster, his friend, when Edward Bulwer Lytton recommended a happier ending that brought the two together. Forster published the cancelled conclusion in his biography of Dickens, and enough people preferred it that the practice of including both in editions of the novel became common. Perhaps because most critics do prefer the original, more restrained conclusion, Dickens' decision to alter his ending has often been regarded as a cynical sop to a sentimental public. Yet whatever your estimation of the two endings' respective virtues, and the published conclusion, while less well regarded, has its eminent defenders as well, it seems to me that Dickens is in fact trying very carefully, in his second ending, not to leave us with the pat, happy ending that Bulwer Lytton, and perhaps his readers, wanted. As many commenters have noted, it isn't actually indisputable that Pip and Estella wind up together at all. Pip narrates that, as they walk out of the grounds of Satis House together, he can, quote, see no shadow of another parting from her, end quote. But Estella's last words to him maintain that they will continue friends apart, as she says, and it is at least possible, if I think not necessarily convincing in context, to interpret Pip's belief as a final delusion. Even if they do go on to marry, it is apparent in this ending as in the original, that the two are too damaged to ever fully recover the promise of youth. Dickens significantly makes them several years older in the published conclusion than they had been in the original, and it is the evening mists, not the morning ones, that rise as they make their way, like Milton's fallen Adam and Eve, out of a ruined garden. There is also, I believe, a subtler sign of Dickens's unwillingness to conclude his novel too neatly. Pip, of course, has discovered in the course of the novel that Estella's birth parents were the convict Magwitch, who was also become Pip's benefactor, and Jaggers' housemaid Molly. Jaggers, at the moment of discovery, makes a plausible case for why Pip shouldn't tell Estella the truth. For whose sake would you reveal the secret, he says. For the daughter's, I think it would hardly serve her to establish her parentage for the information of her husband, and to drag her back into disgrace after an escape of 20 years, pretty secure to last for life. These reasons, however, by now no longer obtain. Estella's brutal husband is dead, and she has abandoned any social aspirations she once held. Why not tell Estella, at last, that she had a father who loved her, who had been, in spite of everything, a good man? Furthermore, the published conclusion, unlike the original, explicitly recalls the last moments of Magwitch's life in which Pip had told him that his beautiful daughter, whom he believed dead in infancy, had survived to become a beautiful lady. The moon began to rise, and I thought of the placid look at the white ceiling, which had passed away. The moon began to rise, and I thought of the pressure on my hand when I'd spoken the last words he had heard on earth. This line creates the conditions for a parallel disclosure. Without it, we wouldn't necessarily expect Great Expectations to require a scene in which Estella finds out the truth, but with it, such a scene becomes conspicuous in its absence. Whatever peace or happiness Pip and Estella can achieve, however, is only available to the extent that they have escaped the designs of master plotters. Miss Havisham, Magwitch, even the lawyer Jaggers, all are, in effect, narrative engineers determined, for a variety of sympathetic and unsympathetic reasons, to plot out the course of another's life. Estella will be the femme fatale to enact Miss Havisham's revenge. Pip is assigned the part of Magwitch's rags-to-riches alter ego. To give Pip and Estella the conventionally happy marriage plot ending, which Dickens, as I've noted, does not quite do, even in the revised conclusion, would be in this context inappropriate, an authorial compounding of the designs of his discredited narrative schemers. On the other hand, Pip and Estella are, of course, not real people, but characters in a narrative that, whether it brings them together or not, will have been inherently constructed and artificial. Pip and Estella's story lacks the almost parodic complications of Arthur's and Amy's, but that only means that Dickens has done a better job concealing his hand. Even the first ending, in which the two merely exchange brief pleasantries when passing each other on the street, is the result of an intricate narrative design. Paradoxically, then, the published conclusion, by highlighting the novel's most melodramatic elements, allows Dickens to counteract the machinery of his own plotting. He brings us to the brink of ultimate narrative satisfaction, only to pull back in a way that dramatizes the difference between the narratively expected consummation of the marriage plot and the pale, ambiguous imitation he has provided. This is nowhere more evident than in the drop thread of Estella's connection to Magwitch. Before Magwitch dies, Pip couples his revelation that his daughter has survived with an admission of his own feelings for her. You had a child once who you loved and lost. She lived and found powerful friends. She is a lady and very beautiful, and I love her. By yoking these two statements together so closely, your child is alive, I love her, Pip compassionately leaves Magwitch to draw the inference that Estella, who is by now promised to Bentley Drummle, loves him as well. It is the natural conclusion for him to come to. Even the illiterate Magwitch cannot fail to grasp the poetic rightness of the notion that the boy he has turned into a gentleman will wind up with his own long-lost daughter. But within the world of the novel, Estella and Pip's case is in fact the inverse of Arthur and Amy's. Clennam and Little Dorrit's relationship appears to progress as a matter of happenstance, but turns out to have been anything but coincidental. Without Mrs. Clennam's guilty secret, the two would never have met at all. Magwitch's connection to Estella, by contrast, is pure coincidence. His identity as her father is emotionally and thematically resonant, but essentially irrelevant to the novel's plot, and to Estella's relationship with Pip. This would no longer be the case, however, if Pip were to tell Estella the truth about her origins, imposing on her the same burden of narrativity that had consoled Magwitch in his final moments, and reinforcing the sense, already acutely felt in the coincidence of their finding each other again in the garden of Sada's house, that there is a fatality driving them towards one another. Instead, the two, like Arthur and Amy, depart from the novel's gaze entirely. Pip sees no shadow of another parting from Stella, and maybe he is right. But the reader, finally, sees nothing at all. We might be tempted to finish Pip's aborted sequence. She lived and found powerful friends. I love her. And reader, I married her too. Instead, Dickens, like Pip, decides on silence.
Margarida Medeiros from Nova University in Lisbon.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Amanda and Elizabeth, to invite me. I must say that I'm not from literature studies and less from native English speaker or something like that. So I read and talk a little slow in order to be understood. I was challenged to speak about photography, family, and 19th century, which I found a little difficult. Because although there are some interesting studies about visualization in 19th century literature or end of the century literature, like Chevry, Proust et la photographie, and some others. And although we could do a lot of very deep study about how the second half of 19th century literature is very visualizing. I mean, in Dickens, in Henry James, and some of them that I know better, like Wells, the Invisible Man, etc. It would be very difficult to connect it with the topic of family. So I decided, I chose to speak about, also to talk, to do a kind of survey about family, how the growing of the nuclear family in 19th century had been intertwined very close with the transformation and the becoming of different photography business and different ways of doing photography since the individual portrait. So I began to read three quotes. One is from Marcel Proust, who is already a little out of 19th century, 1905, where he says, pleasures are like photographs. What you take in the lover's presence is nothing but a negative cliché that later will develop. Once at home, when you have at our disposition this kind of interior camera obscura, which entrance is condemned since we see somebody. And the other one is from Tocqueville, which is quote by Richard Sennett, and is where Tocqueville was already saying that each person withdrawn to himself behaves as though he is a stranger to the destiny of all the others. His children and his good friends constitute for him the whole of the human species. As for his transactions with his fellow citizens, he may mix among them, but he sees them not. He touches them, but does not feel them. He exists only in himself and for himself alone. And the third third quote is from Siegfried Kracauer, who studied photography a lot and cinema in the first decades of the 20th century, and where it says about photography and memory that the meaning of memory images is linked to their truth content, which is very important here because the photography was cultivated between families because of this property of testimony of truth. And it follows saying, as long as they are embedded in the uncontrolled life of the tribes, they are inhibited by a demonic ambiguity. They are opaque like frosted glass that hardly a ray of light can penetrate. So with these three quotations, I want to introduce a conjunction that seems to me very peculiar when we want to consider the role of photography in 19th century family structuring. So my approach is not from literary studies, where, as I was saying, because I work in a communications science department, so and I work with visual culture. So my approach is more interdisciplinary and more close to the social connections between images and social structures. Photography was invented in official terms in 1939, responding to a need that was long researched by several ones in different places, the need to fix the vanishing and fugacious visual perceptions. In fact, it was during his honeymoon that the British Fox Talbot in 1833 was trying to draw a Lake Como landscape with the help of a camera obscura with no success. He was not skilled for drawing. He wanted to send his beloved mother, Laura, a visual record of their travel, and as he later would tell, it was his frustration that led him to insist in the photographic process on his back home, and eventually achieved his first image of the oral window of his home. It's very blurred, but it's, with the lens we could see the 250 glasses of the window. So it was really something very, very important in the history of photography. Also, daguerre, the first to be publicized in its mechanical picture invention, and many others, brought a kind of commodity that soon became a kind of fever. This was daguerre. Photography's invention happened in the context of scientific naturalism and pictorial naturalism. Also, Talbot, the British, was also a botanist and a man of experimental physics. And he did, sorry, it's this one. He did lots of scientific photography also. I was saying, in the context of naturalism, a paradigm centered in the urge to observe, to register, to depict, putting visuality in the first line of modern culture, as Jonathan Crary largely argued in seminal books. As Ancien Régime was vanishing, with what Richard Sennett, in his seminal book also, The Fall of the Public Man, tells us, The Fall of the Public Man on the Social Psychology of Capitalism, called what he called the public man's society or culture. It raised the centering of the individuals in themselves and their nuclear families, turning the subject to introspection and subjectivity, closed in their families and close friends, as the Tocqueville quotation suggests. If we follow Richard Sennett, it seems that photography, in particular the portrait, comes to serve new habits and social forms, namely the rise of the nuclear family. For Sennett, the nuclear form permits orderly human appearances to resolve into a matter of simplified human relationships. The less complex, the more stable. The less one has to cope with, the more one's personality can develop. And this Richard Sennett context, some interpretations of the nuclear family as a refuge or something, a space where one can keep themselves safe, because he understands that the family mainly is a product of the capitalism economy and the need to simplify the life. And at the same time, sometimes the problems of the capitalism economy turn against nuclear family, because as it happens in David Copperfield's first story, the father dies, or the father lost his jobs, and all the family turns very unhappy and with lots of problems. So there's something that we cannot understand family as a kind of refuge, but mainly as a structure that came to respond to a need to simplify social relationships in the realm of capitalism. This is the closing of the individual in a more little circle. This is evident when we visit ancient, It was this couch. This is the closing of the individual in a more little circle, and is evident when we visit ancient collections of daguerreotypes and cartes de visite, but it is this behavior that becomes more evident after the end of the century popular invention of Kodak. For Sennett, 19th century Victorian era is close with or at least in psychological terms, with the new paradigm of psychoanalysis, since both individual and institutions were deeply concerned with retrospection and nostalgia. And so the connection with photography and with a memorizing tool is very important here. The stabilization of the nuclear family can be judged, according to Sennett, from the catalogue of complaints in 19th century family medicine. Complaints were non-catastrophic physical distress with their origins in anxiety, prolonged nervous tension, or paranoid fear. The white sickness came to women who were afraid of being out of doors, even in their gardens, for fear of being spied or observed by strangers. They therefore exercised so little that the face acquired a pallor. In Breuer's work on hysteria, a pre-Freud work of Breuer, such symptoms as compulsive loafing are presented as a reaction to depressions at home, which prevented the person from being consistently pleasing. Another aspect very close concerning with appearances and the need to have a family portrait was related with the importance of clothes, as they are taken as a sign of character. A meaning of the personality of a stranger from the clothes he or she wears still depends on an aesthetic of details. The break between the street world and the stage world of costume has continued to widen, again, not in terms of the specific body images we see on the stage, but in terms of the way we decide that those body images mean. This led to a drive to self-representation of the family, which once portrayed could reinforce the sense of being. With photographic invention, particularly with daguerreotypes, more suited to a very delineated and mimetic image, photographic portrait became a truly world industry. And we have here some examples of daguerreotypes of families, but we'll come over later. Sorry. In this famous book, The Capital, Marx lists 5 industries that employ the great number of employees, named proletarians. Photographic studios were one of them. With portrait photography, an idea of proof and testimony was added to this cult of personality, carrying a sense of time going by, presenting time in itself, as Krakauer noted in his classic test photography. This was one of the main subjects of the seminal Marxist book on photography by Giselle Freund, that I was showing here, sorry, Giselle Freund, photography in society. Observing was since then a cultural role, and appearances became more and more important, a practice that led Balzac to speak about an eye gastronomy, and which was ghostly inhabited by the popular 18th century philosophical thesis on physiognomy by Johann Caspar Lavater, which was this theory from the end of the 18th century that was very popular all along the 19th century in such a way that there were sold portable manuals of this book, which sustained that we could interpret the personality of people just from his features, this face. The individual portrait was already intentionally spread out as practice among bourgeoisie before photography, in miniature painted portraits, silhouettes, visionotraces, etc. With daguerreotype, and for them who could buy it, everyone wanted this portrait done. Also, post-mortem photography was very popular, giving place to advertisements like "Take the portrait of your beloved ones while they are alive," or even after. because children's premature death was terribly frequent before antibiotics and contagious disease vaccination. And we have here, let me see, an announcement about photographing deceased persons taken at residences. So people were looking for photographers as soon as the children or the parents died, so they can take the portrait done, not as death, but as he was alive. So there was lots of instructions how to make the raising of the death, lots of products to do a very good shaving of the death to take the photograph, etc. So, sorry, I lost the line. We know that sometimes we know that. Sorry, I got. Let's see. Oh, I was here. Yes. In this context, the family album, which contains images of generations in their shared moments, occupies in Western culture the symbolic place represented by a kind of palimpsest of familial emotions. We know that sometimes the people in the photograph did not get along very well as we know that images of happy families are idealized and phantasmatic constructions, deriving from the necessity of restraining the entropy that is always on the lookout for tensions and confrontations between members of a family. For this very reason, the family album represents an object of particular interest. As it is a kind of private archive, it follows a pattern that is drawn by chronologies, births, weddings, happy moments, etc., as well as containing captions and commentaries. And it is also determined physically by the model of the album itself, the number of pages, the quality of paper, and its graphic arrangement. As an archive or a family atlas, it has a metonymic vocation. The fragmentary and irregular group of images is supposed to remind people of a whole family history. But it also has a phantasmatic vocation, since viewing the album signifies entering into a relationship of identification with the people represented in it, and consequently, unconsciously acknowledge the fact of belonging to this group, with all of the projective and interrogative implications that this brings with it. Or, in other words, the family album is also a symposium of personalities, working on the family's intergenerational memory. They may be an example or a counter-example of the family's conduct, but they always constitute a motive for reflection upon its identity as a family. And I have here some images. This is two examples of post-mortem photography of babies. There are millions of them, mainly in America, where daguerreotype was very popular until 1851. And after 1851, when the glass plates appeared with this with Frederick Ivans, there came a sort of invention in France by this dairy that allowed to do 8 to 12 pictures at the same time. It was the carte de visite, and this is an example of the carte de visite, which were very little and allowed to put them in the pages of the album. So they were very important to families and they allowed to construct the albums. But also they were used to stage with costumes like these, and to do other kinds of funny pictures of animals, etc. Or this one, or very staged photographs of the family. This one is very known because it's a composite image. It was made from different negatives, And it would be a scene depicted in a 19th century novel of the second half of the end of the second quarter, because it's the family is assisting to somebody who is dying, maybe through tuberculosis or some of these diseases that were very frequently, and it's a kind of narrative in itself. So it's called Fading Away, and it's interesting because Henry Peach Robinson did a lot of photographs with several negatives to make a scenario that he wanted to talk about. With Kodak, so in the album was like this, as everybody knows, and the pages of the albums, there's a sample also. This was a little story that I found in an archive, that a lady came to complain that his husband looks like an ape, and he just asks, well, but the photograph, what's the problem with the photograph? So this was really a very, very common practice among middle classes or little or high classes also, bourgeoisie or petite bourgeoisie, as it was called. But with Kodak appearing in 1888, a new wave came for photography practice. Individuals and their families no longer needed to go to the studio, and this was really a revolution, because Kodak cameras were, Kodak camera, because the families no longer needed to go to the studio, because Kodak cameras were simple, easy, and all the process of developing was made professional in shops and not by the camera users. In the advertisement campaign of Kodak, everything was focused in the family snapshot, and it came out no longer as a masculine profession with heavy cameras, with lots of material that were very difficult for women to carry. But precisely because it was focused on the family events, most advertisements appear with women and children, and we can say that it was a kind of cross-gender object at the end of 19th century. Like we see all the announcements of 19th century Kodak, these ones of the turning of the century, and the other one is from 19th century, I think. All the advertisements of Kodak were centered on the family. Christmas parties, birthday parties, walks in the beach, and women were really a target. And children, they invented the Brownie, a little camera that could be manipulated by any child. So they enlarged the target of photography practice, and the camera entered the family as a normal object in the middle class and the bourgeoisie. So this was a cross-gender object because everyone could manipulate a camera, and if the Kodak did not invent the family rituals like birthdays, weddings, Christmas parties with something that is really something that comes to happen at the end of the 19th century. At the end of 19th century, there was even lots of people didn't know really the day they were born. So the birthday party is something from the turn of the century. The family rituals, the conveying together, the getting together in the photograph is something from the end of the 19th century. And Kodak came to respond to this need. And it was certainly a way of consolidate them as a transitional object, in the sense that Winnicott, the psychoanalyst, talks about the transitional object, something that keeps people insured on their existence, and can manipulate with to feel some comfort and some kind of peace. Of course, for every bourgeois family since then. But families, and this are some of the advertisements. Also, I was talking about walkings on the beach for people who can, of course. Holidays were also a 19th century issue and not before. For the more poor, but was a privilege for the high classes and middle classes that like traveling. And this is a snapshot. So the snapshot is really a revolution at the end of the century for families, because the snapshot is connected with getting the ephemeral fix. And this sense of the ephemerity that was built up with secularization all along the 19th century and all along modern visual culture was really worked out by this kind of cameras that were very easy to manipulate and could catch up something that was happening, like a smile of a child, something that was happening inside the family, and was really a kind of mirroring of the family and of getting ensured of its unity. And but we are talking here just about family photographs that were taken because people wanted to be in the photograph, wanted to get together in the photograph, or individually to send to people who were immigrants, who were in other parts of the world, or traveling. They want to send the photograph of newborns, etc. But we are always talking about an intention of getting a photograph. But this was mainly something that was possible to middle class or high class, as I was telling. And there were also families that were not able to achieve to get a camera, and which poverty and condition could not really aspire to it. So, but in another sense, they came to photography also. Not as voluntary self-displaying, facing the camera, not to become a social commodity and a group mirror, but as a matter of social interest and political warning. Poor families were the subject of photographers like Jacob Riis or Levi's eye, which pictured the terrible tenements in Lower Manhattan at the end of 19th century, a kind of Dickens visual matter, or the way families did send their children to factories to provide a little more funding for their lives. So, if the 19th century did raise nuclear family as a mirror for the self, expressed in the continuous interest of picturing themselves in studios or at home, also worked out a sort of invisibility of non-bourgeois family, of workers and poor and suffering ones. In his essay, Civilization, Stuart Mill, as Jordan Bear underlines, discusses this bourgeois centering in commodities in private life. It says, I quote, all those necessary portions of business, of society, which oblige any person to be immediate agent or ocular witness of the infliction of pain, are delegated by common consent to peculiar and narrow classes, to the judge, the soldier, the surgeon, the butcher, and the executioner. Because the spectacle and even the very idea of pain is kept more out of the sight of those classes, we enjoy in their fullness the benefits of civilization. Just to conclude, we could say that families in the 19th century came to the picture in both ways, as subjects, as an object. In the first ones, being photographed was an act of desire. To the second ones was a passive and involuntary ones, since they were not posing to get an idealized appearance and to get seen by others, but rather were just rescued from an invisible condition by some who thought they should be presented in light. And I just brought some of these pictures from other kind of families that were made at the end of the 19th century by Jacob Riis and Levi-Stein, for instance, but we could pick many others all around of the world that were motivated by social concerns and against child labor, and were concerned how other families really lived. So thank you.
I have a question quickly before I forget. The peach necklace that you mentioned, was that staged?
Yes, no, it's not staged. It's is made by different negatives.
Oh, he melted them?
Yes.
So there was somebody who's actually...
It's a kind of staging, but it's a post-production staging.
But you took someone who's actually dying and took a picture?
No, in fact, this picture, he has a picture of this girl alone.
She's sleeping or she's dying?
No, she maybe she's dying. We don't know, but she can be sleeping. The main paradox in photography is that at the beginning of photography, to be photographed alive, you have to simulate that you are dead, because you have to be like how do you call
Death?
yeah. Cadáver, como é que se diz? A corpse. You have to behave like a corpse. But to have a photograph of a post-mortem person, you have to take care of him or her as he was alive. Because what we want is a memory. We don't want him as he was dead. You want him as he was alive. So it's a kind of interesting paradox, because to seem alive, you must stage the corpse, and to photograph a corpse, you have to stage him as he was alive. They did that a lot with children as they were sleeping. They simulate they were sleeping, but they were really already dead. It's something that our culture couldn't really held in the houses. That person in photograph, we couldn't bear that.
Was there a name for this process?
The composite photography? No, it's the composite photography. That's the name, because we did the final one with different negatives that you manipulate in the camera obscura.
Question. I'm just wondering, Margarida, how much of these photographs were staged or performed, and how we can relate that to literature and plotting with families in literature, in the sense of we have live performances in literature, we have this sense of plotting something. And I'm just thinking of that because a couple of days ago, there were photographs by Émile Zola that went under auction.
Yeah, he did a lot of photographs,
Yes,
Zola.
So hopefully there will be at some point an exhibition of his photographs. But he was trying his photographies to, well, first of all, he was taking pictures of his family, of his wife, his children, and his mistress. But he was trying to be as naturalistic as in his literature. So I'm just wondering if we have something similar here in terms of being realistic, naturalistic, or plotting something staging.
So,
Such a parallel.
both styles coexisted, in fact, because at the time in around 60s there were Julia Margaret Cameron that only did staged photographs with his children and friends, and because she was very influenced by Raphaelite painters and very close friend to Gabriel Rossetti. So she imagined scenarios in stages and mythical Greek mythical figures, and did photographs like that. But of course, the naturalism side of photography was what was important, because otherwise, what could we have, especially from photography, in realistic representation, if you have, since perspective in Renaissance, already paintings, much more detailed sometimes than photography. So the character of testimony is really important. Another thing that about what we're saying is that all photography is at a certain point stage. We know that, right? If you are aware of social networks today, every photographs are potentially staged or staging or made to be understood as natural, but they are. The natural is a staging. The naturalism is a style, for me at least. So it's a figure, a style, but most of the times the people who is in the studio, they are composed to make a certain kind of portrait, of group portraits. And there are some stories very interesting of people that has some money to go to the studio and borrow the clothes of the owner of the house, the servant, and she's catch up with his master's clothes, and she says, "Oh, sorry, it was just to go to the photographer," because she was wearing something that she was pretending. She wanted a little better clothes, so she borrowed the owner of the house dress and went to the photographer and was catched up in the middle. So we are always talking about staging and about getting an idealized image of the group. Of course, Zola was very interested in photography also because of that side of testimony and reality. Well, and it's very interesting that he did a lot of photographs. Yeah, there a great collection of photographs, and although of Degas also.
I was wondering, I mean, that seems like it sort of connects to your paper, Carra. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could weigh in on that, Carra, because I was thinking about how, what you said, Margarida, about how naturalism is itself a set of conventions, and of course, you know, so it's
the snapshot is
realism. And it's interesting to think about Dickens. I liked the way you laid out how Dickens sets up a certain kind of convention and then disappoints it, and those examples are so great. I actually hadn't thought of them in that way before. So how much do you see him as, I mean, this isn't much of a question, I suppose, but after hearing Margarita's paper, I'm kind of thinking about what you were saying about this is, it is, we can see where the convention would be, but we're stepping back from it.
I mean, I think certainly, and Dickens is such a theatrical person in general, where although obviously he becomes a writer, I mean, he initially wanted to go into theater, and certainly many of his works are illustrated works. And in the background to the Victorian novel, you have not yet photography, but you have prints. You have people like Hogarth, who has these narrative stories, you know, the Rake's Progress and the Harlot's Progress, that is setting a precedent, I think, for using visual material, first of all, just as a companion to text, and doing it, giving it an equivalent to a kind of narrative, giving it a kind of conscious narrative weight, so that a visual image, it's not just necessarily the snapshot version. The idea that this is something that's going to be staged and can have narrative purposes as well is, it seems to me, embedded in the 19th century form, both of the novel and of, say, the illustrated sketch. So I think, I mean, that kind of relationship where you say both of them are forms that there's an impulse growing during the 19th century towards a kind of realism in literature, but at the same time, there's a paradox because, of course, even a realist novel, you're working really hard to give it that impression of realism. And in these photographs that on one hand saying, well, I'm capturing life as it is, but that takes a lot of really hard work. So I think there really is a parallel in both forms during this period.
Well, just to add something, you couldn't put photographs even if you wanted to, because it was impossible to print photographs until the 90s. So, and at the same time, photography was not very good to if you want to depict something very well. That's why scientists, for instance, they preferred drawing to photographs until very late, because the photograph is at the same time very precise and very vague. And if you want to make a point, a very precise point, the photograph can't help you.
Plus, they were manipulated, as you just showed.
Yeah.
But also
Right.
with the ghosts, there were a lot of ghosts.
Oh, right, ghost photographers, yeah.
Pseudo ghost photographers and putting little specters. You know,
Yeah, even the Christmas Carol was highly illustrated with and there was a lot of industrial stereoscopic photographs made with ghosts, suggested by a physician, and they did a lot of stereoscopic photographic images inspired in the Christmas Carol, in the Marley, the ghost,
yeah.
Marley's ghost, yeah, appearing to Scrooge.
Appearing with the tree.
Yeah, I have one.
I thought those two papers you've worked really well together as well, but my questions were specifically Carra, and it was a really fascinating paper, and I especially loved the example from Little Dorrit. I mean, when you put it like that, I mean, you know, how many times have I read Little Dorrit? I'm still not quite on top of all of that you.
That's actually what led me there, where I'd read it multiple times, and every time I forgot exactly how it worked out, because it just doesn't make sense, and it's so stupid.
And it was very persuasive that Dickens, in a way, was being quite knowing about those conventions, and in a sense, familiarizing them, I guess, or throwing them into some kind of questioning. But that also jars those, I think, for me, and I wondered if it's happened for you as well, with Dickens as the man on stage, or Dickens so wanting to take his reader with him and to believe that this is true. You know, it says about Nancy in the preface, you think that a prostitute can't be that this is not a good portrayal of a prostitute, but I tell you, it is true. You know, he says in capital letters, and then he loved it on stage when he was doing, I don't know, it was Frozen Deep, I think it was, and one of the Turner sisters was weeping over Dickens's body, and I would say to her, it's not real. You know, this corpse-like position on stage. It's not real, although he was absolutely thrilled that the audience felt that way. And he seemed to be so, taken away with that idea, this is true. And yet, there's a real discrepancy there with what you're saying, which I find extremely persuasive.
Well, I mean, one way I might frame it is to, first of all, look at the trajectory of Dickens's career, whereas I think while some of these things, it's not like he ever becomes, the king of realism. On the other hand, when you look at his early novels versus his late novels, you do see a clear pattern of becoming somewhat more naturalized, avoiding some of the high melodrama, or avoiding at least some of the excessively neat, huge family meeting endings that you'd gotten in the earlier ones, where I think you do have something of a naturalizing of some of those conventions as you go on. I also think it's significant that some of these gestures, I think when you see them, they do tend to happen towards the close of his novels, where it involves the ending rather than something that's been going on. So I see it as more of the kind of, I mentioned Prospero in there, where it is almost the kind of like coda epilogue, where now that the story's done, we can kind of acknowledge and pull back the stage. Of course, he was more consistent with his throughout, the Thackeray kind of like, applaud the puppet shows over, I'll put them back in the box. I think that sometimes authors, including Dickens, even though I think as he's writing, yes, he absolutely wants you to believe in it and buy into it, to say at the very last moment, I am going to, doing it at the very end doesn't have, I think, the same damaging effect. You can almost bracket off the ending. And even early in the career, I mean, even in the old Curiosity Shop, it doesn't have the same sense to it, but he does this whole image with the magic reel has played out. Let's see, you know, what these last few frames will show. So again, you have a moment, I don't think that he's as troubled by it there as he will be later, but you certainly have a moment where you're violating immersive realism here. I mean, you're not getting, I mean, you can no longer say, yes, you had the moment where the reader was desperately waiting to find out what happened to little Nell, but once that's subsided, you do have room for a kind of coda where you can acknowledge this was part of the staginess, and I'm now showing my author's hand as I wind the magic reel.
That's
We're a couple of times, so we will continue. But thank you, it's great speaker.
The 19th century photography is so interesting. You know.
It was just a kind of survive. That's a very interesting thing because of the rating of the albums and the Kodak snapshots.
Yeah, and it is so interesting that you think, you know, oh, photography's here, so now what's the advantage of photography? It captures people exactly, but of course it doesn't. It's very staged.
Yeah,
you know? It's, oh, now it's real. Now.
Yeah, okay, but I don't want it real.
Yeah.